if we're talking about a society that was trying consciously to change gender relations, which I'm going to start with, then we have to think about what were they trying to change, why were they trying to change it, what did this have to do with their larger goals? And a question that I think would be interesting for your students is, because you can't ever resolve it, I love unanswerable questions, to what extent is attention to gender a goal in and of itself in the early Soviet Union, and to what extent is it instrumental? In other words, when is it being raised for other purposes? And I will argue, and have argued in my book, The Baba and the Comrade, that one of the reasons the Bolsheviks were interested in gender early, starting in from before 1917, was they had multiple instrumentalities. One was to get women's vote in the period before 1917. There were factory committees in Tsarist Russia, and they pushed hard for women to get the vote on those factory committees because they hoped that women would be very left in their politics, that they could influence agendas. They was to break the power of the church. They perceived the church as what they called, their favorite word at the time was obscurantist. Obscurantist means teaching people backwards, stupid, blinkered ideas. Obscurantist because they had to learn the law of God, where the law of God told you always to be humble, to accept the power of the lords, to live without questioning. And they wanted people to question and change society. Now, I'm not saying the law of God is a bad thing to teach, but they definitely thought it was. They thought it turned people into sheep. And that's what they didn't want, right? So they're breaking the power of the church. They're also interested in breaking the power of pre-revolutionary feminism. We'll make our own women's section of the party so that feminism will die on the vine. We won't have an uppity, angry, demanding feminism. We'll have a tame women's movement. That's part of the larger revolutionary goals, right? We'll have, the other thing that I am convinced is that they wanted, in part, to bring women into the political sphere. One of the things they talk about over and over again is getting women involved as deputies, getting women involved in the workplace, getting people involved in decision making. So it's a mobilization regime. It's a regime that has its own goal of getting every single person involved and pro-Soviet. Again, you can look at the pros and cons of this. If you think this is totalitarian and evil, but if you ask people today, there's a lot of nostalgia for the pioneers, which were the little kids movement, the Komsomol, which was the youth movement, and even among some people, though definitely not all, for the party itself, as a way of getting things done. We have a lot of Soviet jokes about building on enthusiasm. And so one of the other things to understand is the degree to which the early Soviet regime was combating backwardness in general. I think one of the things that united everybody was a feeling that Russia was backward. The word for backward in Russian is отсталый, which means standing behind, left out. When Russians went to Europe, they saw cafes, glittering life, they saw very robust workers' movements, if that was what they were into. And what did we have in Russia? We have workers in chains, practically, literally in chains. I mean, really, really oppressed. So if we get everybody involved, we can make a better society. And we're going to get rid of all of the signs of backwardness. And the signs of backwardness, many of them had to do with women. The signs of backwardness were illiteracy. Women were vastly more illiterate than men. And literacy, as we know well now today, definitely affects how you raise your kids. If the mother is literate, it's the best predictor of whether a child will get some home head start on schooling, right? So literacy, syphilis rates, infant mortality, drunkenness, again, an area that women could have an influence on men. So another piece that I talk about in my book, The Baba and the Comrade, and I'll explain the title in a minute, is the use of women to have an influence on men, to have an influence on the society. If they're the ones who've been left out of politics and the workplace, then when they come in, they might not be as corrupt. They might be able to run things more effectively. There's also a pre-Soviet stereotype of the strong woman, and this is the word baba, who tells you what to do. And this stereotype goes all the way through. In the 80s, when I first started going to the Soviet Union, with common knowledge that you wanted to avoid, if there was a man who was in customs and a woman in customs, you wanted to avoid the woman because she would be too tough, right, Alexis? Right? If you were going to a store, you didn't want to tangle with the woman, Prodavщица, the saleswoman, because she was tough. Women in public places became very, very tough. But they also had a reputation as being the moral head of the household. And so if you're going to combat alcoholism, there are a lot of ways you want to get women involved. Right? So we'll talk a little bit about that function. The stereotype of the Soviet woman is this 1930 poster of the woman with the smokestacks. She's got her kerchief tied behind her head. If it were tied under her chin, it would be the symbol of a peasant woman. She's a woman worker. She's strong. She's in the factory. She's undaunted. She's the emancipated one. And they use the same word for emancipation that they had used in the 1860s for the emancipation of the serfs, right? So it has connotations that go back to serfdom, which was universally recognized, as I think it's universally recognized in the United States, to have been extremely oppressive, bad thing, right? You can have different views about race relations in different parts of the United States, but I think I don't know. I assume nobody wants to go back to slavery, and certainly in the Soviet Union, serfdom was an unquestioned, and there was a lot of poetry about the poor peasants and their chains and so on and so forth. So one of the things we need to talk about is the ways in which the idea of eliminating exploitation is also about creating loyalty to the state, creating loyalty to the party, creating involvement in the party, and getting women into the public sphere, right? But also getting them into the public sphere in a way that makes alternatives not acceptable. One of the things that's very interesting about this regime is, like an Orthodox party or an Orthodox religion, they're extremely intolerant of difference. They don't outlaw homosexuality, but until the 30s, but they ruthlessly ignore it, and put down anything that's perceived as decadent. They don't outlaw feminism, but they get rid of the feminist movements. They again and again go after movements that look different. So, questions so far? Okay, so one of the ideals, and this again I talk about in my book, The Baba and the Comrade, is the ideal of the comrade. Comrade is a term that, to a Russian speaker, has a neutral sound. It doesn't sound, tavarish is not a particularly masculine word, and it's because it doesn't end in a masculine, it ends in a masculine ending, but it's not a strong masculine ending. It's an apparently neutral word. So one of the legacies that we'll have to talk about is this notion that men and women are really the same. There's no problem, and we'll see how that changes. But that's the initial ideal. The problem is that when you get down under it, the ideal of the comrade doesn't really have room for gender differences, and we'll see they come back with I'll say with a vengeance in the 1990s, and when we get there, and even in the 60s they're coming back. Anyway, so what I want to do today is I want to take a minute. I want to talk about the early ideals. Then I want to, and then I want to talk about the 60s and 70s. Then I want to talk about Vladimir Putin and the expressed use of masculinity in his image building, and how masculinity is in a way a substitute for an alternate ideology. You can't be capitalist, you can't be communist. What is Russia? Capitalism still has very negative overtones. The oligarchs are routinely despised. They must have gotten their wealth unfairly. There's a very strong, one of the things I think is interesting to work with students around is the morality of a society. It's not just that it's totalitarian and evil, it's that though it was totalitarian, and though we spend a lot of time in my classroom on the terror and the purges and the famine and the violence against individuals, there's a core of strong moral value of justice and equality and fairness. And so capitalism is not acceptable, but they can't go back to communism, and in particular, Putin can't be communist because there's a communist party that's a threat. But they can't be social democrat. That sounds, too European. They can't be Christian Democrat. That sounds even more European. And they're a multi-ethnic, multi-religious society. So I argue, and this is other work, but we can talk about it if we have time, that Putin's masculinity is, in a way, attempting to be a unifying force, the strong leader of a strong state. He personifies the strong state by being apparently strong himself. The other thing I want to talk about is something that's been in the news a lot. This is an older photo. The group Pussy Riot, who put balaclavas, the ski masks, on their faces, imitating the ski masks, I think, that the armed forces use when they have done some high-profile arrests. They come in ski masks and armed guns, and they're coming in as punkers. And this is something I think students would be interested in learning about, is what does this punk rock group think of the masculinity of Putin. And one of the things I'm going to talk about at the end, if I have the time, will be a little bit about today's protests against Putin. They're dying down, but there's still little bits and pieces, and especially this winter, very much the issue of masculinity was at play. And is it good for the country? Is it demeaning? Because his masculinity, and this is why the concept of masculinities is important, his masculinity is very much alpha male dominating other males. And I'll try to see, if I have time, I'll try to show you a little bit about that. But that domination of other males ultimately is not very satisfying to those other men in the long run. So anyway, that's just background. If we can get there, we will. So we're going to take a start with, the glorious ideals of the October Revolution that in the background, I don't know how well you can see it. Do you find her as a club of women workers, a library, a kindergarten, the home of the mother and the child, a whole set of institutions. So one of the goals of the early Soviet regime was to create new institutions that would liberate women from the kitchen, from the burden of, and this is one of the topics that comes up in every period in Soviet history, is this question of the burden. Lenin himself has some amazing quotes about how the horrors of backward life in the kitchen. And there are Russian proverbs that a woman's path is from the stove to the threshold. She doesn't get out. Many misogynist proverbs: long on hair, short on wits. So the woman, but basically the thrust of many of them is that women don't get out, so they can't see the world. It's another question whether they, anyhow, don't want to go too much. Anyway, the notion was that this combination of labor and knowledge would liberate women and give us a new way of life. The word for way of life, I don't know if Chris explained this at the beginning, is one word. It's byt. Byt is the verb to be, but it's also the whole way of everyday life. And so there was a hope that that when the woman peasant and the woman worker meet, they can exchange knowledge. Especially the woman worker can bring the woman peasant books and ideas, and through her labor she can demonstrate a new whole way of life. Here's this idea that you're going to get women out of the kitchen and you get rid of kitchen slavery. And behind her is that she's opening the door from the kitchen, and behind her is a new building with a club at the top, and then a dining room in the middle, and the words new life in the front. One of the challenges, though, and we'll see this is part of our story of the 60s and 70s, is that there was a great deal of emphasis on women's interests as mothers. So here's a flavor of it. Mothers, give your infants breast milk. On the left is a woman who's giving the child a bottle, and on the right is a woman giving the child the breast. And the woman with the bottle is surrounded by graves, and the woman on the right has a nice clean park. But what I want to stress here is this way that mothers are on the spot and bad mothers are on the spot, in contrast to good mothers. ring a bell? It's like America too. You know, how often it's the mother that carries the guilt, the responsibility, oh my God, I'm not doing a good job. Not that fathers don't, but it's the cultural stereotype. Here's another one that I like. It's better, my son really liked this one. It's better to buy your your children books than to scold and beat them. It goes up in black. Better not to, better than beating and scolding is to buy, and the books are in red, of course. So, yeah. So a whole new ideal. This one I wanted, again, is this emphasis on the aid should give nurseries and parental aid to the woman worker and the woman peasant, or birth aid. It's the mother who needs the aid, right? And it's the state that gives the aid. And one argument that many people have made is that this leaves men out of the equation. Where are the men? And this isn't good for men as well as it isn't good for women, right? Because what's men's role? And one of the arguments that's made, one of the things I'm going to get to, starting in the 60s and 70s, but especially the 80s and 90s, is a kind of crisis of masculinity. What is men's place? If they're not the lead breadwinner, there is a Russian word for breadwinner, kормилец, the one who feeds the family, because women work and men work. If they're not raising their kids, what is their role in the family? And do women need them? Do men need to be in families? And so on. So this re-essentializes. Here's a society trying to get away from the stereotypes and also at the same time kind of re-essentializing the role of women. And then, oops, sorry about that slide. Childhood. Then a little, I'm not going to talk much about this, but an assumption that the ultimate patriarch, of course, is Stalin. It's Stalin who gave us our happy childhood. This is a very common quote from the time. In about 30, this picture is from 38, but in 1936, Stalin started talking about what a happy life we all have, even though they were just in 34, he's talking about it. We're coming through this period of famine, just devastating famine in 32, 33, 20 million people died. They had rations right up to 34, 35, rations in peacetime, which is, pretty horrendous. The countryside has been devastated as they've been forced into the collectives. We have a happy life, and then the slogan was, and children repeated this every day in their little pioneers, thank you, Comrade Stalin, for a happy childhood. And of course, people did have happy childhoods. I mean, that's the other side of trying to understand everyday life, is to say, well, people enjoyed their childhoods too. It's not, and scholars have debated this. The ideal for men was often military or in the Air Force. This is strengthen the Air Force. Крепи мощь военного воздушного флота. So which is again assumptions that are gendered. In World War II, many women did fight, particularly as their famous group of pilots. They were also in the lines just behind the front. That they had these awful units called Smersh, which were the front line of troops were doing the fighting. If they started to retreat, there was a line behind them that had orders to shoot them if they retreated. I once had a landlady who said to me she had been in those units. And I went, oh, and she said, oh, it was an awful time. No one would eat with us in the dining hall. I was like, dude, I'm paying my rent on time, you can be sure. I think you heard a little bit about this. The regime had decided that abortion should be illegal. It was principally for pronatalist reasons. They wanted more babies, more children. They also, from the beginning, had been ambivalent about abortion. They were absolutely convinced that while, if it was done properly by a doctor, the operation was safe enough, they were convinced that it would lead to infertility in the long run. They really didn't want, it was a necessary evil. It was better than a back alley abortion. They made exactly the same arguments that in the Roe v. Wade period people began making here. A back alley abortion is dangerous, and therefore we should legalize it, but they hated it. And they did it without anesthesia. They shamed the women who came for them. In the course of her life, in the Soviet period, especially the late Soviet period, a Soviet woman would have 7 or 8 abortions. Because, and here's the economics of it again, what's the alternative? Provide contraception, right? But contraception is a consumer good. And this was a regime that was hell-bent on industrializing and producing steel. You're not going to produce contraceptives. They did produce some condoms, but they were hard to get, they were thick, they were considered galoshes, that was the Russian term for them. And they produced, and they tried very, very briefly at one point to produce the pill, but they never produced it in any quantities, and they never produced IUDs, to my knowledge, or if they did, it was only for the very elites. The majority of women, the vast majority of women, would get pregnant and have an abortion with no anesthesia, with lots of shame attached to it. So, okay, so the 30s is a whole idea of mobilization, women and men both going into the public sphere, but nonetheless subtle gender differences. If we go back to this image, then I need to go ahead, of the praise for the mother heroine, I meant to include some pictures from, they make a special holiday for women, the March 8th holiday, when you are supposed to bring flowers. To this day, men are very gallant and bring flowers to their girlfriends, their wives, sometimes their sisters, and children bring to their women teachers. You know, it's a whole flowery holiday. And what I think is very interesting is that March 8th is the holiday for women, and there is a holiday for men, which is February 23rd, which is Red Army Day. There's actually a bunch of them. There's Red Army Day, there's a different holiday of the Border Guards. What's particularly interesting is that the February Revolution, which toppled the Tsar, actually occurred on February 23rd, and it was led by a women's strike. They were actually on strike, and what is not as often told, although Rochelle Rothschild has done research on this, it was a strike for women and the vote. And I need to do some research on this, but by very early on, I would say probably by 1921, they were actively eclipsing the February Revolution because they wanted the important revolution to be the seizure of power in October. And so then they had to do something with that. And even though the Red Army is actually, I can show you the decree founded on January 15th of 1918, they now make the Red Army date February 23rd, and they will tell anybody who asks that that's when the Red Army was founded. And then March 8th, which had been a holiday, it was a pre-revolutionary holiday in Western Europe and a little bit in Russia from 1910 on, they make that the Women's Day, but they soften it, they take any demands out of it, it's all about just bringing flowers and being nice. So again, the reification of gender, even when they're allegedly making gender not matter or making comrade the ideal. So this tension, that's why gender won't go away, it's because it's a tense thing. Women are the same as men, but women are different. Of course that's true in every society, and it's actually probably true. Women are the same as men and different from men. But the ideals and the reality are constantly clashing in the Soviet period. Here we have, I'm not sure the date of this, but the woman voter and the woman who's a deputy. By the 60s and 70s, they become very proud of women's, and they may make a big deal about women being in all positions in Russian society. The problem is that, as we know, this is not a democratic society. The votes really don't matter. There's the Soviet system. Soviets are councils. The Soviet Union gets its name because it was supposed to be all power to the Soviets. In fact, the party takes power and eclipses the Soviets. So the Soviets exist, and they do some local decision making, but nobody has much power. So to be an equal member of a nothing body is not a great step forward. The real tension between the propaganda and the real life comes in the 60s and 70s. People begin talking about struggling with the issue of the double burden. On the one hand, women are supposed to go to work, and on the other hand, they're supposed to raise the family. And if you think about it in many ways, we could talk about a triple burden. Go to work, raise the family, and raise the children. Stand in long lines. There's a wonderful Soviet joke that I don't remember all of it, but basically in the Soviet Union, we'll pretend to work and you'll pretend to pay us. We'll all pretend to have everything, but there'll be nothing in the shops. There'll be nothing in the shops, but there'll be everything on the table. Yeah, I think there's a couple more lines, but there is that tension, and this was experienced by anybody who went to the Soviet Union. Did any of you go to the Soviet Union? But you heard about it, right? The American press hammered home again and again the long lines. What the economists say is that was actually repressed inflation, because the people had money, but they didn't have goods. So people stood in long lines for things, but the people, and occasionally men stood in lines, but what the reality of everyday life, and was that women were the ones who took time off from work to slip out and buy food for their family. So they'd come home, they'd come back to work with a string bag with sausage and cheese and bread and whatever they could find, and they would buy not only for themselves but for their coworkers. Everybody knew everybody's, but yet very much women's sphere. So that means it gets very hard for women to get promotions at work because they're managing this double, triple burden. Long journey to work, long lines for food, getting their kid somewhere else to daycare. Often the daycare was in the building where you lived or near in the courtyard, so that was good. The thing you have to remember is that men were, especially in the immediate post-war period, men were a rare commodity, and they remained a rare commodity for a while. So we also have literature about the men coming back from the front and assuming enormous power because they were frontoviki. They were men who had served. So women were willing to, for the sake of having a man, women were willing to put up with a lot. He might be bossy, he might be domineering, he might lie around on the couch all day, but many women were willing to put up with that. The flip side, though, were younger women who said, well, I'm not even going to bother to get married. Why bother to get married when the state's going to give me all I need in the way of child support? I'm going to have to do all the cooking and shopping anyway. And as one younger friend of mine said, I don't know how widespread this was, she perceived, having a man is just like having another child.
That's how it sounds.
Her own mother had raised her completely out of wedlock, and she didn't see why she should bother getting married. She needed a man to get pregnant, but that was all she needed him for, in her perception. So that creates a situation where you have rampant divorce. In the 50s, you have one of the highest divorce rates in the world. Women don't need men, and men don't need women either. I mean, if you think about it. And yet, 2005 to 2008, the number of deaths by assault, women, what is this, per 100,000, 900,000 female deaths by assault, and 3,200,000 deaths of men from assault. The leading causes of death for men are cardiovascular disease, as everywhere in the world, but the second leading cause is accidents, injury, and poisoning. And the third is a very high, not third, is suicides. Men are 7 times more likely to commit suicide than women, and 6 times more likely to be murdered than women. So the question that 2/3, so some more statistics. This is from a 3-year study by the International Family Research Institute in Moscow. 2/3 of male mortalities in the age group 20 to 55. In 2/3 of those male mortalities, the man was drunk. Men's heavy drinking is, of course, implicated in the high accident and injury rates. Every year, thousands, and I'm not exaggerating, of men die of drowning in pools because they're drunk. It can be in a small pool of water, but you fall over and drown. Then there's also the problem of domestic violence. 30 to 40% of all violent crime takes place within the family. 14,000 women are dying every year at the hands of their male partners. There's a ton of problems in the 80s, 90s, and today of returning male vets. They call it the Afghan syndrome. 2 issues here, not just the post-traumatic stress disorder, which is extremely high, but also opium and heroin addiction that they brought back from Afghanistan. I'm not sure why we aren't hearing more about that in the U.S., but I would bet you, if anybody's seen the statistics, that I would not be surprised if American men and women, service people, are coming back with opium addictions because of being in Afghanistan. And then, of course, in the 90s and the 2000s, you start getting the Chechen syndrome, men coming back from the Chechen wars. Again, almost exclusively male combat force. There are almost no women except in supply positions, and coming back with violence and alcoholism and drug addiction to cope with the post-traumatic stress disorder. So even in the 60s, you can see that even in the 60s, if we go to this one, the first date on this, I'm sorry it's so blurry, is 50. Even in 1950, when the male life expectancy here is about 60, or almost 61, and female is 67, there's a 7-year gap, even back in the 50s. In the 60s, people start talking about this gap. Of course, life expectancy in the United States is also longer for women than for men, but I think this is one of the largest gaps in the world, the difference between women and men. And so in the 60s, people began talking about a crisis of masculinity. What is men's position in society? Are they under women's shoes? Are they unnecessary? What's their role? Combined with this, what Chris was talking about, men as the dominant force in practice in positions of authority, creates this kind of tension over what is men's place. What?
Oh, sorry, I just,
Go ahead.
The last
one is 2010. It skips from 2007. It's 2010, 2007, 2004.
Oh my God.
So by this data, and the problem with data is, it depends whether you're looking at the UN data or somebody else's data. There are actually different numbers out there, but they're all in the same order of magnitude. I mean, I don't know what other developed country would have a male life expectancy of 60 years from birth. Yeah. So Putin, icon of masculinity, right? Putin comes to power as prime minister in 1999. He's elected. Yeltsin says, "I'm resigning on December 31st, 1999. My heir, if he gets elected, still appearance of democracy, will be Vladimir Putin. Putin is actually elected in March 2000, and so on." These are the iconic masculine pictures. This is one of my very favorites. Fly fishing, drinking from a tin cup. He's in fatigues. There's a military subtext here. He's riding the horse, the Marlboro Man. Marlboro cigarettes, there were giant posters of them in the 90s, so it's not accidental that this looks like the Marlboro Man. He's at the this is the 1930s image I wanted to show you. This is 1950, the strong male who, zakalyaysa, temper yourself, take a cold shower, This is Putin in front of Tsar Nicholas II. But one of the things that's really interesting is the use of this. I should stop. Let me just take a quick sec. This is Yeltsin appointing Putin, imagining him as the golden fish of fairy tales who will grant all your wishes. He's hoping that Putin will grant his wish, particularly that that Yeltsin be not charged with embezzlement and corruption. This is Putin and Medvedev, but a Western cartoon, and Putin and Medvedev. I'm a real president in 2008 when Medvedev comes in. I forget where these go. Okay, so, all right, so now, what I want to do, though, is, because there's not enough time to really do the Putin masculinity thing, is talk about the protests, because I'm convinced, and here's where I'm a little bit out in left field, but I think this is just really, really interesting stuff about gender. I'm convinced. So, September 24th, Putin announces that he's going to run for president again, and that Medvedev will now be the prime minister. Medvedev had taken over as president, and Putin had been prime minister in 2008. This is actually when most of the super masculine images come in 2007. All of a sudden, he's going to be the national leader, nationalny leader. One of the things that I think is interesting about this 2011 moment, this fall, as it's just a postscript about why gender is still alive and well, is that the usual assumption is that the protests that start in December are about elections. People go to the voting booths and they bring their cameras and they do monitor irregularity after irregularity after irregularity. Every polling booth, virtually, they find irregularities. They shoot them on their cell phones. They post them on the internet. There are particular sites where they're posting all these irregularities. The assumption is it's about democracy, because that's what we think in the West, and it is. But what I would argue is that they went to the polls to find the irregularities because they knew they were there. They knew they had always been there, and they knew earlier they didn't care. Putin looked like the best candidate for most people's purposes, and they didn't care whether he won by 80% of the vote or 60% of the vote or even 50% of the vote. They were fine, and they knew they were in the minority if they didn't want Putin. But in the fall, they began to criticize Putin, and the second assumption is usually that it was the problem with Putin. If it was the problem with Putin, it's the problem of him as a dictator, and that he was going to be in power for another 6 years. I think that's true. But what I think about Putin's masculinity is that it itself becomes demeaning to the intelligentsia, who see it as simplistic, caricatured. It's monochromatic, and boring to youth, who, it's not hip, it's not interesting, it's always the same thing. And I think this is where it's really interesting. It's insulting to men broadly. And I'll show you some slides where men say, we are not sheep. Men and women say, we are not sheep in their protests. So what happens is, September 24th, Putin not only announced that he would take power, but very shortly after that he had said about him and Medvedev, we had always known we would trade places. And this becomes known as castling, because in chess you can switch your rook and your king. You can only do it once in chess, and but you can switch the plates. They've switched places. And what's interesting about saying we've always known this is that it's fundamentally insulting. That in 2008, when people speculated, and in 2011, when people began to speculate who's going to be the next president, if they had always known who was going to be the president, is that a democracy? So it's profoundly insulting. It's profoundly boring, because he announces he's going to basically run unopposed, and it's excessively masculine. So here's one of the spoofs on this. Putin and Medvedev shown together. Why don't I be on top this time, right? Veiled allusion to homosexuality. Who's going to be on top? The one on top is the male, the one on the bottom is the female. This is the prison jargon of homosexuality, but this is the Russian mentality about it as well. This is just some protests, but let me show you the protests. Okay, so there's a generic photo of protests. I am not a sheep, Yani Baran. People start showing up with homemade signs, which they've never had in the Soviet Union and in the post-Soviet period. And they say, fly away, Botox man, because they begin showing that Putin is actually probably, and I think this is actually possibly true. If you look at photos of Putin over time, he was blonde-haired and sort of had some various wrinkles coming. Now there are no wrinkles in the current Putin photos. But this is the best. Putin at some point said, he got really upset about the first protests, and he said, let me find the quote because it's really important. Frankly, when I looked at the television screen and saw something hanging from someone's chest in one of those demonstrations, honestly, it's indecent, but I decided it was propaganda to fight AIDS, that they had hung, a condom on their chest. He thought that the early protesters who were wearing white ribbons were wearing condoms, so he said. So people get so mad at him that they start showing photos of him with a condom around his head. Here's another one with him as a condom around his head, and the sign on the side says, Emperor of Russia Vladimir V. They're sick of that. Warning, do not reuse. This song came out for Putin's 50th birthday, ostensibly from below, but really to show his power. And it's very, very much around masculinity. No. This is ostensibly Putin watching it. There's several versions. There's the guy who thought it up, and then there's the guy who wrote the song who claimed he wrote it just for a bet, because somebody had said, you can't get in the top airwaves unless you have $1 million. And the guy said, oh, I want to bet? And he wrote this, and he had found this women's band, found these two women, they made up a new band called Singing Together, which had never existed before. Suddenly it's all in the top airwaves. So want to bet he could do it by just having a song about Putin. Now, the response, the next one we're going to do is the paratroopers, which is the second page of your handout. So, Я хочу такого, как Putin. I want someone like Putin. It doesn't actually say in Russian, I want a man like Putin. In this song, they say the paratroopers, which are one of the most elite, most masculine the paratroopers anywhere are a very respected branch of the armed forces. They have to jump behind army lines. There's a ton of mythology and important respect for them as male members of the, they sing, I'm no different than you. Я такой же, как ты. So Russian, like most Romances languages, has French would be tu and vous, Spanish it's tu and usted, or German is du and sie. Russian has the same thing. I want one like you, the familiar you, to make it clear that it's the singular you, not the plural you. It's and so what the paratroopers sing, and I'll play a little clip from that, is you're no different than me. In other words, you're just like me, a person, not a god. I'm no different than you, a person, not some hick. You're an ordinary bureaucrat, not a czar, not a god. For you, a person is a stupid banderlog. This is something that is a direct quote from Putin. He had referred to them as, banderlogs are in Rudyard Kipling's Jungle Book. They're monkeys. The ribbons of freedom are positive for all, but for you, they're nothing, just condoms. And the opening is also very strong. If you are a citizen, if you are a president, there is a law for you. There are forbidden acts. Don't steal money from the treasury. Sorry, there's a typo there. Never lie. Be open to all. Keep your word. So, let's see if we can. There, the uniform too. Sorry. There's a law for you too. Don't ever lie. And then we get Pussy Riot, which is a feminist group, again, and they've been in the news. The one you have here is a song they sang on Red Square where they're not allowed to perform. They're very loud and raucous. So those are the Kremlin bells. Here's the place of execution in Tsar's times. It's a very amateur video. Abort to the system. Abortion to the system. We want freedom, we want revolt in Russia. Bunt is an elemental rebellion. So like all punkers, they're not interested in doing things neatly and tightly. They're interested in making a statement, and a very strong one. Recently, they're on trial. As you may have seen in the New York Times, they're on trial right now for a they're on trial right now for, yes, good, here it is. These are the words. A song called Mother of God, Drive Putin Away. And I'm going to play it for you and then I'm going to stop. O Virgin Mother of God, drive Putin away. Drive Pagani. Black robe of the church, gold epaulets. All parishioners crawl to bow. The phantom of liberty is in heaven. Gay pride is sent to Siberia in chains, meaning gay pride in the same way that we have gay pride. The head of the KGB, their chief saint, leads protesters to prison under escort. In order not to offend his holiness, women must give birth and love. Blah, blah, blah. And then a Virgin Mother of God become a feminist. The church's praise of rotten dictators, the cross-bearer procession of black limousines. A preacher will meet you at school. Go to class, bring in money. Let me play this for you because you can see they're trying. What they said about this was that they actually, one of them came, who is a believer, came home from church and said, nothing's working. We have these demonstrations with hundreds of thousands, millions of people out on the streets. The photos are incredible of how many people are. And that's not getting rid of Putin. We're going to pray to Mother of God because that's what we need to do. So I'll just show a real quick clip of this. Wait, I'm going to start back at the beginning because it's really pretty. This is a traditional. Oh, sorry. Come on, sorry. Incompetence here.
Oh, they can turn the volume off.
No, I can. No, it's so hard to see. Can we kill the light? Now they turn into bunkers. This is people trying to stop them. So that just gives you an idea. I don't want to take more time because we're sort of short on time, but this is a beautiful church that was rebuilt in post-Soviet times, but it belongs to the city. It's actually not church. It's secular property. But anyway, they're being charged with hooliganism. They didn't break anything. They didn't harm anything. They did what they considered a punk prayer So there's a huge debate. There are a lot of religious people saying, there's no respect for religion anymore, they're blasphemous. And what's really bizarre is that the prosecution has charged them practically has mentioned that it's an abuse against God, which is the same thing as blasphemy. How a secular prosecutor, and technically from day one, October 25th, 1917, there's been a separation of church and state. How a secular prosecutor can charge someone with blasphemy, abuse against God, is if it was crime against church property, you could say it's property, but abuse against God implies that it's blasphemy in the very old sense. And so the defense is saying, look, this is like an inquisition. They're all young, several of them have children, 3 of them are on trial, and
They're being held.
they're being held. They've been in jail without bail for 6 months, which you would never do for a crime that had no victims. Nobody was hurt, absolutely not even a threat. Nobody was even no punch in the face, no nothing, and they're being held in jail without bail, without only minimal access to their lawyers, no access to their family. So anyway, so there's a long presentation. Sorry, I had so much to say. Okay.